Hello and welcome to Dr. Poole's SharePoint Surgery session, Success Strategies for Migrating from Shared Drives to SharePoint. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. If you're interested in trying out an enterprise version of Harmony, please send us a request in the chat window and someone will contact you after the webinar to get you started. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available to you within a couple of days. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across the EMEA and Asia-Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him 18 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. Before joining Harmony in 2011, Richard worked for Dassault Systems PLM for over 10 years. Richard also has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Automotive Engineering from Loughborough University. Richard, please get us started.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks everyone for joining today. So the whole premise of the session today really is to give you some pointers as to how Harmony can facilitate the challenge that is migrating data from older systems like file shares and also, let's say, maybe older SharePoint implementations as well into newer platforms. So we'd just like to ask you a question, a kind of show of hands to start with.
So which of the following best describes your current status? Are you planning to implement SharePoint? Are you using SharePoint on premises, but you're planning to move to SharePoint online? Have you implemented SharePoint, but people are still using file shares? Users just won't use metadata and insist on using folders in SharePoint? Or are all users fully utilizing SharePoint with metadata for document management? I'll give you a minute to vote. And there you go, Richard.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Thanks everyone for participating. So actually, almost half of the attendees have implemented SharePoint, but people are still using file shares, and I think that's really quite representative of certainly people I often speak to and interact with. So, I think there's definitely challenges involved in migrating to SharePoint and getting. I think that we can break it down into three areas that we'll focus on, which is like the migration of the data, migration of the people to actually use a different interface, and migrating to a different way of working. And I think it's it's a big project. If you've got lots of years and years of data in lots of file shares, terabytes and terabytes of data. Getting that into SharePoint is a real challenge, but also kind of identifying what you put into SharePoint, because there's a number of different approaches. Do you take everything and just put it in, which is not necessarily a great approach? And also, how do you classify it, and how do you find content later in SharePoint? Because obviously there's a big difference between SharePoint and a file share. So how do you add value to the data that you're putting into SharePoint so that people then get to experience and use and take benefit of a different platform? But as I say, getting people to change the way that they work is always difficult. And also, if they've got multiple places to store their content, that's always a challenge as well. So if you've got legacy file shares, but you've maybe got SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams and maybe a few different flavors of SharePoint as well. It's very, very confusing for end users to know where to put their content and what the benefit of each of those is. And also, obviously, again, moving from one version of SharePoint to another can be very challenging for the end user as well. Even if it's just that, the look and feel is a bit different, or the buttons have moved around, or the icons are a bit different, people, again, don't necessarily like a lot of change. So as I say, we can break that down into three main categories. One is actually the migration of the data itself. Now, as I say, one approach is to take on mass lots of data from your file shares and move that into SharePoint. But it is a very time-consuming task. Obviously, there are migration kind of solutions in the marketplace to facilitate and help with that. But it's really down to the people who have used the data and created the documents that are in there that know best, the value of the documents, what it should be used for, how it should be categorized, and all those kind of things. So it is a very costly process, and also you can really end up with moving far too much content into SharePoint that is just unnecessary. If there's a file shares, people, over the years have used and abused really, and put lots of content in a file share because, okay, that's where I've got some space. I can store, my backup or my personal documents, or I think we've spoken to other customers in the past where they've actually found instances where people have backed up their entire music collection and things like that to a file share. So there's potentially a lot of unnecessary data in file shares. And I think a different approach is to give people a mechanism to selectively migrate the content that they see value in. And this is where we've seen a lot of success, that Harmony really facilitates this. So really kind of, notify the end users that they have a period of time, let's say 3 months or 6 months, to move their important content. In that time, the file shares can be made read-only, or after that period, so that people really have to start moving their content that they need to use moving forward into SharePoint. So maybe active projects and things like that that they may need to work on in the future, then they need to get them into SharePoint. So Harmony gives an easy way to drag and drop documents from shared drives to SharePoint within a familiar interface in their Outlook. I think, obviously many of the people on this session today may be using Harmony or have looked at Harmony possibly for the purposes of moving emails into SharePoint, maybe coming from public folders or PST files, and getting emails to be stored collaboratively. But Harmony can do a lot more than that as well, and we'll see that as we go through the session today. Capturing the content and classifying it, and really helping people to use a more proactive method of migrating content. Now we've also got some great case studies. One that was quite recent is Canada Post, the Canadian Postal Service. There's a link here to a case study, and they also presented at last year's European SharePoint conference to tell their story of their migration path. And I think they kind of really covered it very nicely in that they went down that route, that initial route of mass migration, and it was just taking too long. It was too difficult to move content, and that was another one where they were finding unnecessary documents, massive amounts of unnecessary files in file shares that they really don't want to put into SharePoint. So they started to use Harmony for all their users to give them a selective migration method, and by doing that, they actually put the mass migration kind of approach completely stopped it. So they estimated that they've saved millions of dollars by using that selective migration and giving the power to the end user to actually migrate the content that they need, rather than doing it en masse and trying to put in algorithms and things on how the content should actually be moved across. Obviously, moving the content is the first challenge, but the second challenge is, okay, in a file share, the only way that you can organize your content is in folders, because there's no metadata and there's not really that kind of control over how you can organize your content. So, people have been using folders to organize their content for many years. I mean, I think, I would say since the dawn of desktop computing, a folder structure is kind of what's kind of fairly natural and intuitive to people. If I want to save some content for a particular project, I'll create a folder with that project name and I'll upload my content into there. Now, obviously, that's got lots of different challenges in it. That it's difficult to find content. Most people only really know where they've stored their content, and they've organized it in their personal way. Everybody's got a different filing system. Maybe it's by first name, maybe it's by last name, or whatever. And also, you end up creating these really long file names that, because the only thing that you've got to use to describe a document is the folder it's in and the file name that it's stored with. So you do end up with this kind of general mess of lots of duplication of documents, lots of content that isn't really required, and it's very difficult to find and things. So there's obviously a key benefit in using metadata when moving to SharePoint. So again, when we're capturing content with Harmony, there's a few different things where we can really help it with that as well. For example, prompting users to enter required metadata when they're capturing the content. If you drag and drop multiple items in, you can apply metadata on multiple items at the same time, whether that's a document, a set of documents, or in fact a folder structure if you do need to use folders in SharePoint. And obviously applying things like default metadata, default values. And I think another thing that we'll focus quite heavily on in the demonstration later on is kind of organizing your content using SharePoint views that are being grouped by different properties. And again, Harmony can not only display that information in a way that looks a bit like a folder structure to an end user, but also using that to actually apply the metadata as well. So if you've got a grouped view, you can drag content, again, multiple documents and things on top of a value that is being used to group that view. And then it will apply, or give you the option to apply that metadata from the group to the items that you're uploading. So again, we'll look at that in a few minutes in a lot more detail. I think the other challenge, as I say, is end users actually changing the kind of day-to-day tools that they're using, and I think the people are used to a folder structure, like we can see here. I mean, this is just an example of some legacy projects on a file share, and if you're then asking people to use maybe one flavor of SharePoint in the past and maybe another version of SharePoint now, again, they look pretty different. Maybe you're trying to get people to use OneDrive as well, again, looks quite different. And now more recently, Teams, for example. So you've got lots of different interfaces to access all these different repositories. And it's very challenging for end users because at the end of the day, they just want to get their job done. They want to save their documents and be able to find content that they may need to use in the future. So it's important to try not to change the user's behavior too much, but obviously you're changing the underlying technology. So I think having Harmony within Outlook, which is an interface that everybody's familiar with, it's fairly consistent, but they're all the users are already spending a lot of their time in, then that really helps. But also kind of displaying the content and the locations in a consistent way in a single interface and allowing people to drag and drop content both into and out of those repositories, and also between them as well, as we'll see in a few moments. So here's a kind of first look at the Harmony interface and the fact that I've got actually some SharePoint Online sites in different tenants here. I've got some SharePoint on-premise, in this case 2010 environments. I've also got my OneDrive, and I've also got my Teams, all in a single interface that if as the user moves between those, they've got a consistent way of working, and obviously where metadata and content types and things apply, then they'll be utilizing those. But being able to copy and paste content between those locations, maybe from an old version of SharePoint, and you want to migrate some content into a new SharePoint on-premise, for example, SharePoint Online, for example, then being able to do that in that single interface is very, very helpful for the end users and the whole migration process in general. So on that point, we'd just like to ask another question before we go into a demonstration.
So please let us know, what area do you see as the biggest challenge in your organization? Is it data migration, moving from folders to metadata, adopting the new user interface, or all of the above pretty equally? Thank you. And Richard, I'm going to share the results.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan, and thank you again, everyone. So interesting. We've got more than just over half of everybody says all of the above equally, which I completely understand. I think they are all very important factors, and I think they're all big challenges. I think the second one was moving from folders to metadata, which again, I think users really, really struggle with, because it's changing the way that they've been working for many years. So on that, let's take a look at a demonstration of how Harmony can help all three of these different areas. So some of you obviously may be using Harmony already, maybe you've evaluated Harmony, or maybe this is the first time you're seeing the interface. But basically it's a sidebar within my Outlook that obviously I can interact with the rest of Outlook. I can drag and drop emails and attachments, all those kind of good things. We're not going to focus too much on those today, because I think we wanted to really highlight the added benefits of actually moving a user from file share method to a SharePoint kind of collaborative platform. So as I said here, having a single interface into all of my SharePoint sites, whether it's a SharePoint 2010 environment, that obviously the equivalent there in a browser looks like this, but then if I go into let's say a SharePoint online environment, I get the same kind of UI from a Harmony point of view, but actually, obviously from a SharePoint point of view, the functionality is quite different. The UI is quite different, and again, people don't often like that kind of change. And taking that to the next level as well, things like OneDrive. I know a lot of people are moving from obviously a local kind of storing their documents on their own machine and moving those into OneDrive, so it's backed up and accessible from different locations and things, and also Teams as well. So they're all different interfaces, but having them all in one UI within Harmony is very, very powerful. We'll see a little bit later on how we can actually move and copy content between them as well. So let's actually go into, let's illustrate some data that I've got maybe on a file share. This kind of legacy projects folder here. It's got a whole folder structure underneath it with documents in each of those folders. Now, what we can do with Harmony is, if I actually want to move that data into SharePoint, I can do that in a number of different ways. So let's just go into a couple of different libraries that I've set up to illustrate a few different things. So if I go into like my kind of standard document library here, I've already dragged in that legacy projects folder. So I can simply just do that by taking that folder there, dragging it in, and then uploading that. And what that will do is it creates all the content underneath it. So it's automatically created the folder structure for me. If it's nested folders, it will go and do that recursively and upload all the content accordingly as well. So that's, obviously that's very helpful if you just want to basically replicate what people have today in terms of using folders. Obviously, that's great for getting content into SharePoint, and people can obviously start working on that. It would also capture, for example, things like the document properties from any of those files, if there are any, and the corresponding columns in SharePoint. So you can actually capture some of that kind of legacy information from within the documents as well. So what I can also do, though, and I think the biggest single challenge that people highlighted out of those three a moment ago was moving from that folder structure to a kind of metadata-driven approach. Because obviously here, yes, you're now using SharePoint, but I'm using folders, so it's kind of there's issues around that and things as well. It's not necessarily a great practice, but I do understand that some implementations do kind of implement folders in SharePoint because their users have kind of demanded it, really. But I think this next bit really is where we're going to kind of hopefully open some eyes and give you some ideas on how we can move away from that. So if I go into a different library here where I'm not creating folders, so I'm using metadata, I've got different content types, and I've also got different views configured in this library. So in this instance, my default view is being grouped by, let's say, the account name or the project name or something. So you can see it's nicely represented. Everything's grouped together very easily. I can collapse and expand those as I need to, but also I can obviously I can configure lots of different views in my libraries, and they could be grouped by different properties. So I think that really helps users to start to see the benefit of, yeah, that works better than a folder structure, because now maybe some people want to navigate by region in this case, and other people need to navigate by account or project name, or a mixture of the two, really. And as I say, you can create obviously multiple views and things there, and group by different properties. So one of the things that we can do here when capturing content with Harmony is actually to say, okay, I've got some content in one of these legacy folders. Let's go to this alpha project, and I want to capture these documents, but I want to essentially tag them with that alpha project name as well. So I can take multiple items from here, and then I can just drag and drop them on top of the actual group name. So in that case, if I just wait a few seconds, I can say that I want to save that with a particular tag. So in this case, it's going to prompt me to choose the content type that I want to use for these items that I'm selecting. Obviously, it's picked up any content types that are firstly the default for the library, but also available to me from SharePoint. So they're actually all reports. And then it's going to go through and upload that content. It's going to, as I say, pull in any of the kind of file properties and things that we saw before, and it's obviously going to apply the common metadata, in this case, the alpha project name. So here it's actually presenting me with a UI to actually apply common metadata to all of those items that I'm uploading in one hit. So for example, here, it's taking that project name. I haven't had to do any more to that, but also then I can say, okay, actually these were all final reports, and it was a legacy project. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and it's going to apply all of that metadata to all of those items, check them in, make them available to other users. Now also, again, that's automatically applied like the region there as well. So if I go to my region view, I can see those documents that we just uploaded a second ago. So it's nice and easy, excuse me, for the end users to actually start to, as I say, capture that content, classify it in a great way. But also, if I then need to say, okay, well, a couple of those, they weren't final, or I need to set a different property on some of them, then I can select multiple items from that view and say, okay, these apply to a particular category or something. And then it will just apply that metadata to those two items that I've selected. So again, really nice and intuitive, easy for end users to kind of start to grasp the concept of using metadata. Now, what about if I've got some other projects? Let's take this Delta project, for example, and I want to capture those and classify those with the Delta project name. Now we can see here that I don't have a name, the Delta project. So instead, I'm just going to drag that in, and you'll see that again, it goes through the same process, but I'm not in this case going to apply a kind of value that's already there, because I actually need to add it. So in this case, again, these are going to go in as documents, and I've actually made the account name here a required property, so I need everybody to at least assign that property when they're capturing the content. So in this case, you'll see any required property is highlighted with a red dot next to it, and I can go ahead and actually see that I can choose from any existing tags there. So obviously I've got a term store assigned to this, and in this case it's an open term store as well. So I can see that the Delta project isn't there, so I can create a new item for that and then apply that particular project name to all of those items that I'm uploading. So very, very easily, I think, people can navigate around. You can also, obviously, with grouped views, you can have two levels of grouping. You can obviously have multiple views as well. So it's very, very flexible. And it means that, obviously, if you change something, like we saw before, okay, so actually maybe these two documents weren't relating to the Delta project, but I need to update those to the Alpha project, let's say. Again, just making that change actually updates that view. And from a user's point of view, it kind of looks like, okay, well, I moved it into a different folder, let's say, by changing the property, but you haven't. The document hasn't gone anywhere, hasn't moved. You haven't lost any version history or any changes to the document. Everything stays intact. And obviously, the metadata can be dynamic and things as well. So it's represented in a very, very nice, easy to use manner. Now, one of the other things that I kind of highlighted was obviously moving content from, let's say, one SharePoint instance to another. So if I've got some project documents in, let's say, an old SharePoint on-premise 2010 environment, and I've got some content there that I need to get into my new SharePoint Online environment that we were just working with a second ago. So I can easily just copy and paste those documents. I can use keyboard shortcuts like Control-C and Control-V and things, as well as contextual menu things as well. So if I just navigate back to where we were working before and say, okay, I want to go to that by project view in our project documentation. And in this case, I actually want to just paste that. So I can easily just right click and paste that document, those two documents here. Apply, obviously, the content type that is applicable here. So let's say these two are proposals. And then obviously assign any required metadata. So, okay, these also relate to the Delta project. Again, so very, very easily, I can see how these documents are being organized and utilized. And then I can take all the other benefits of having these documents at my fingertips. I can work on them directly from here. I can preview content from here. I can easily find, I can search, I can share the content that I've got there. So for example, here, I can just click into the top of the sidebar and search, for example, for anywhere that proposal is mentioned. Excuse me. And it's going to return any results from that particular library that we'd navigated to. I can also search throughout my SharePoint libraries and sites that I'm connected to. And then, for example, I can take one of those documents and share it with somebody if I need to send it. So many of you may be familiar with this kind of functionality. But for example, if I now need to send this document to Susan, who's also working on this project with me, I can simply drag and drop that document into my email and send Susan a link to it. And when I hit send, Susan can, I can check whether Susan actually has access to that document or not, and I can grant her view or edit capabilities in that instance as well. So I actually want Susan to be able to edit this document, and she can work collaboratively in my new SharePoint environment with me. So just going back to presentation, I've just put some slides and some links in the slides here to online documentation and training videos. There's lots of information on our website that can cover all of the functionality that I've discussed today, but also there's a link there to register for an enterprise trial.
And at the same time, you could just easily, if you're interested in a trial, click yes, or I would be interested in trying Harmony Enterprise, and we will get in touch with you after the webinar to get you set up. And while you are looking at that, I'm going to start reading, Richard, some of the questions that have come in. One of the things you talked about, Richard, how do you get people on board with this?
So in terms of kind of getting people on board from migrating and making sure that it's a success, I think from experience, from our customers' experience, it's actually quite good to take, let's say, the most challenging group of users initially to kind of iron out all the requirements and the challenges that they have, and then I think in most organizations there's usually one particular department that have the most demands and the most complicated data and things. So if you can take their folders, for example, their shared documents, and get those into SharePoint in a good way, work the kind of views and the metadata accordingly, then that really kind of can show that it is successful and can be successful, and basically I think everybody else then kind of learns from that experience within the organization.
Great, thank you. How do you sort or show by project? Can you show that again?
Okay, yeah, sure. So in terms of sorting and showing information, in this case, for example, I've got the project name defined as a property on all of these items, and then I can display, can create a view. So if I go into the same kind of location here, this project documentation library, you can see here that I've basically created that project view that I can then go and just, if I edit that for a second, just to illustrate what we're doing there. So I've got two views that are being grouped, one by project, and essentially I'm just displaying the project name as well as some other key properties, and then saying that I want to group it by that project name. So Harmony will pick up the views that are available. It will also pick up the default view that you've defined. So I created that as the default view in this library, and whenever I navigate into that library, that's the first view that will be displayed. And then I can choose to, for example, here I'm actually hiding the label of the group, whereas I think in the web interface it doesn't look quite so easy because you're displaying like this project name every time. But here I can actually choose to hide those labels. So again, it makes it look a bit more like a kind of folder structure that I'm grouping by these properties.
Nice, thank you.
I can actually then go ahead and filter that view as well. So let's say, okay, maybe I've got 100 projects in this particular library, but I'm just interested in the documents that have been tagged for the alpha group or something. So as I type ahead, we can see that the client name there is actually being displayed to me, so I don't have to know exactly what I'm typing, but then it just filters that view, which is still being grouped by that particular property. To illustrate that a little bit differently as well, if we actually change to this region view, obviously here I've got fewer number of values, but in each region I might have a number of different projects. So I can still here have this view being grouped by the region, but then I can filter it by the account. So again, if I go Delta in this case, then you'll see that the view, as I say, is being grouped by one property, but it's being filtered by another.
Very nice, thank you. Can you provide any broad info on how best to back up your data in SharePoint?
In terms of, I mean, that's more on the kind of SharePoint backend, I would say. Obviously, as Harmony, we're focusing on the client side kind of interface. So, however, you've got your archiving and backup and kind of policies implemented in SharePoint, they're going to be honoured and displayed by Harmony. But in terms of that kind of back-end infrastructure, I'm possibly not the best placed person to advise on that, but I'm sure there's plenty of other kind of people that focus more on that.
Then I'm going to ask you a question where I know you can be the expert here. Someone asks, can you drag and drop emails into a library?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned it briefly earlier. Obviously here today we're focusing on capturing documentation and working with that. But also, if I've got emails, like even just let's take this email about today's webinar, I can simply drag and drop that into the sidebar. It's then going to be stored as a fully contained MSG file. It's going to be tagged in my Outlook to be to kind of indicate that it's been saved to this location. It's also Harmony is setting the content type for that particular item. It's mapping all the header information, and in this case, it's just prompting me really for that project name. So in this case, I'm going to go and say that this relates to that alpha project again.
Great. Someone else is asking, what does the star above the icons in all sites means? Which makes me think maybe you should just go through all of these little icons here.
Oh, what, down here?
I'm not sure if they mean.
Okay, you mentioned, yeah, so you mentioned the all sites view. So yeah, absolutely. So here, for example, as I say, I've got a mixture of different kind of locations based on the content. The icons here with stars on are sites that I'm following, and that obviously could be within whichever SharePoint environment I'm connected to. And then I can just navigate directly to them from here. So this is dynamic. It comes from your SharePoint user profile. So if you go into SharePoint and follow a site, it will automatically appear in Harmony. We can also provision the sites that you want users to see here automatically via registry keys. So for example, here I actually provision typically this demo site and one or two others via my registry, and then all of the other ones from construction down to tech sales here are actually all created as what are called published links in SharePoint. So again, automatically, just by me connecting and authenticating to my kind of initial site, everything else gets added automatically for me based on my user's profile. So I get to see my OneDrive, I get to see my teams that I'm a member of, and I get to see my followed sites and things. Excuse me.
Okay, so in order to give everybody a little bit of time, I'm only going to ask a couple more questions, and anyone who we don't answer here we'll follow up with. So where's the question I wanted to ask here? Can you transfer emails from mobile devices?
So we have a Outlook web app which is available in all versions of Outlook. So whether that's Outlook on the desktop, Outlook on a browser, or Outlook on a mobile, basically I can save content. If I just go to, let's say my Office 365 account, log in as myself. So I'm just showing you in a browser, but obviously you can access this in a browser on a mobile device and those kind of things as well. But as I say, it also comes through to different versions of Outlook. So for example, if I take that email, you'll see that I can then go ahead and save the email directly from this interface, and Harmony in that kind of app will step me through capturing the content, and that could be obviously an email like we've got here, or it could be, for example, an attachment from an email. So if I take a look at let's say some of these other emails here that have got, just looking for something with an attachment. There we go. So then I can choose whether I want to capture the email or capture the attachment or both, and then choose where I actually want to put that item. And again, I can see the sites that I'm following and the kind of sites that I've connected to.
Thank you. Can I use Harmony for a group inbox that's managed by multiple members?
Yeah, I mean, Harmony is an integration into Outlook. So, I mean, obviously, I can connect to multiple mailboxes in a single Outlook client, and then I can capture content from each of those different mailboxes into SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, etc., from the Harmony client. So essentially, Harmony is kind of a window into your SharePoint, but just happens to reside in your Outlook interface, and obviously can work with shared mailboxes and multiple mailboxes and things.
Excellent. As I said, if we haven't answered your questions, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. Richard, thank you for that wonderful presentation. And thank everyone for joining us today. You'll all receive an email with a link to view the webinar again in a couple of days, and we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Thanks.